this talk today is really about trying to help everyone get to grips with reading the ACT budget, which comes out tomorrow, and just get your head around some basic things around budget literacy. So this is part of a broader push by ACOS. So over the last year, we've made a real effort to try to support the sector, both in writing submissions, but also in understanding what goes into the budget and how to read the budget papers. So this session specifically is really just on the actual budget papers. So you have an idea what's coming tomorrow and what to look out for, and particularly where to find key pieces of information in the budget. Now, by no means do I have all the answers on everything to do with the budget. I do have significant experience with Commonwealth budgets and analysing them in academia. And we've obviously passed a lot of information via Treasury to make sure we're understanding how they look at things. So I'll do my best to talk you through everything and to take your questions as we go. So on that note, we're going to get started. So the first thing I want to do is just make sure we understand exactly what the budget is, because I think it's sometimes misunderstood. So public sector budget does three things, as I've got on the screen right now. It expresses the political priorities of the government, so it is still a political document, but it does two other things that are really important. It outlines the specific priorities and target outcomes for the public sector. So they are, in many respects, the most important people or groups involved in the budget. And critically, if you're looking at how the government sets its targets and measures its targets, the budget sets the priorities and the target outcomes, and annual reports report on how the public sector has gone against those priorities and target outcomes. These documents actually talk to each other. The third thing is that the budget specifies exactly what money will be spent and by whom in the coming year. So this is an appropriation of public funding. It's passed by Parliament and it specifies exactly where that money is going. And I'm going to talk you through exactly where it shows those things. So the budget papers include about 700 pages of material, which is one of the reasons that we're having this conversation, to talk about exactly what you're looking at when you look at it. And that material is released over a series of documents. It's more than a dozen documents usually. So we'll just talk you through briefly what they actually are and then what you expect to find in each of those documents, so you can navigate your way around and find what you need to. So I'll go through these in more detail in a moment, but first document is the budget outlook. That's the overview of the budget. So that gives you the broad picture of the fiscal and economic state of the ACT. It gives you all new measures that are in the budget. So any new spending that is happening that wasn't in previous budgets will be included in the budget outlook. So it gives you all, it's got a lot of information in that document. It's the biggest piece of the whole budget because it includes all the economic and financial reporting and the estimates of where the economy is going in the ACT, as well as those new measures. Second, we have budget statements. So this is directorate specific priorities and spending allocations. These documents are a little bit less glossy and they tend to be more big tables of data. But this is where you will find recurrent spending, so existing spending, and any directorate staffing levels and those sort of things as well. You then have supplementary documents. So things like summaries of transfers of responsibility. So last year, for example, HCSD, CSD and health merged. So you had a series of documents here acknowledging where that money was moving from one agency to another. You'll see this also where if responsibilities for certain policies have moved from one directorate to another, say there's a disability education policy that moves from HCSD to education, there will be a supplementary document that will summarize exactly how much money has been moved from one of existing funding from one directorate to another. Now, I want to pause for a second and say, Leanne, please yell out if I've got questions, because I can't see the chat right now on my screen because I've got the PowerPoint up. So feel free to jump in anytime, guys, if anyone has any queries or would really like a bit more information. So those three components, the outlook, the budget statements, and the supplementary documents, they're the legal bit of the budget. So that's the bit where The actual appropriation goes through Parliament, and the Legislative Assembly has to assess and actually approve that spending in order for it to happen. We then have the government priority statements. I call this the purely political bit because they're a little bit different. This is things like the wellbeing budget statement, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander budget statement. These are areas where the government has significant priorities and wants to make a statement about what it's doing. They're really helpful for giving you a good summary of what's going on, but they are more of a political document than an appropriation document in that they will talk about past spending significantly more. And I'll get to that in a bit more detail and why you should be a bit wary of them. Okay, let's step through these one by one so we know what we're looking at. First up, we have the budget outlook. The role of this document is to give the overall picture of the budget. If you were trying to understand the ACT budget and you wanted to skim through a single document, it would be this one. So I put up the table of contents there because I think it's helpful to just understand how it steps through what's going on. So the first thing that happens in this document will always be a broad overview of the budget and the economic overview. So the ACT does its economic overview based on the fiscal position released by the Commonwealth, which is why the budget is timed about 3 or 4 weeks after the Commonwealth budget. So initially, they will give an economic outlook that will look very much like what the Commonwealth just released, with their own tinge on it. Now, this perspective will give you a fiscal overview as well. So it'll talk about how they're looking to spend and how they're thinking about the budget. In general, this will look pretty similar every year. If the ACT is going through a downturn, they'll say money is tight. We've got to be really careful about how we spend our money. We've made some difficult decisions. If times are looking good, they'll generally say basically the same thing. They'll say, we've just come out of a tight period. Things are really difficult. We've got to be really careful about how we prioritize. It's much of a muchness. What they're really trying to do is set the expectation that any spending they've spent is something you should be grateful for, and the position is relatively difficult. They don't want to look like they have large amounts of money to spend. They want to look like they're being fiscally responsible or constraining their spending. That's more about the politics. What we know about where the budget is at this point in time is that there is a significant debt in the ACT. They are not in the best shape fiscally and have limited levers to raise taxes in the current environment. So we do know that this will likely be quite a more negative outlook in that we have really constrained spending is what they're likely to say. Then they move forward into the budget outlook. That's the chapter 3 bit there. This is where you're going to find all the new spending. So any new expenses, any new revenues, that's section 3.3 and 3.4. That's where we're looking at all these new measures. So that in chapter 3 in the budget outlook is where you're going to find any new spending by the government and any new revenue measures by the government. And they will have a paragraph on each, as I'll show you on the next screen. They frame this generally in terms of investing in the well-being of Canberrans. That's it's a well-being strategy, so it's sitting in kind of in that zone. The end of the chapter has the financial statements and balance sheet metrics, as well as infrastructure spending. This is more the tables and things that will show you, I guess, the more accounting side of exactly what's happening with the finances, and tend to be a bit more complex to understand, but also often a little bit less necessary for most community sector actors. So what are we actually talking about? What does this stuff look like when you look at the screen? I've got 2 tables here that are in every budget, which is the economic predictions. So this is that first table on the left of your screen. That's the forecasts for what the economy is going to do. This is based on the Commonwealth forecasts, so saying how they expect the economy to grow or shrink in the coming 4 years. The second table there is the government headline net operating balance. So that's their overall revenue and expenses. So pointing out a couple of things here, just to make you aware of how they present information in the budget. It's always presented in the same way, which is built on 4-year forward estimates. So you see you have last year's budget line. So these tables are from last year's budget, obviously, given this year's is released tomorrow, and it'll tell you what they predicted the outcomes were for last year. That's the 24-25 budget. They'll tell you what the estimated outcome is of that budget. So did they perform as expected or not? And then they'll have the next 4-year estimates of what they're expecting to spend or and revenue they're expecting to get. Now, take the headline net operating balance with a grain of salt. This is trying to tell you whether the ACT is in deficit or surplus. However, it does not include capital expenditure, so it doesn't include infrastructure spending, but it does include grants towards infrastructure from the Commonwealth. So it is a distorted figure that is used to present a more rosy, it will always present a more rosy image than what is actually the case. So bear that in mind whenever you're looking at their headline figures. It's a general trend. It doesn't include infrastructure. Does someone want to jump in there? Sorry, I just heard a noise. Okay. All right. So now this is probably the most important bit as far as community sector organizations go, reading the actual budget tables. So I'll just give you a minute to absorb that slide and to explain through like what we're seeing here. So on the right of your screen, you've got the table. So this initiatives table goes for multiple pages, and it lists by directorate every single new spending measure that is in the budget. So that's your master list, that table in the Outlook, in the budget Outlook, that has every single measure that sits in the budget. And it explains whether it's a capital cost, so is it infrastructure, or is it not infrastructure, basically. That's that first or second heading there, the net capital, net cost heading. It then projects the spending over the coming 4 years into the total spending. Now, this is where we get a little bit confusing, because what this table is actually telling us is what is the overall impact on the budget of this measure. So I'll repeat again, it's telling you what is the actual impact on the budget, not how much money are we spending on it. So take a look at that first highlighted one there, the delivering food relief for vulnerable Canberrans. In the table, it's listed as $0, as costing them $0. If we look at the top to the left, you've got the actual measure, and this is how they're listed in the budget. And we can see that it's offset. So what that means is that in the description, it tells you it has been offset from existing resources of the Health and Community Services Directorate. So in other words, they have moved $1.5 million from somewhere else, unnamed, in HCSD, and that is being used to pay for food relief for vulnerable Canberrans. So what that table is telling you, that cost of living delivering food relief for vulnerable Canberrans, it's saying the government's actually spending $1.5 million on that measure over 4 years. But relative to the bottom line of the budget, it will cost them $0 more than they were previously going to spend. So I know this is one that gets confusing, because we can see the exact same thing happening on the third one I've highlighted there, the implementing recommendations from the Long Yarn report. So it's really important when you're reading the budget to look at the table and then also to look at the specific measure, because the measure will tell you exactly in which years the money is being spent, and it'll also tell you if they've shuffled money from somewhere else, which is called an offset, in order to pay for that measure. So the table, again, will tell you the overall impact on the budget. The individual measures under expenses will tell you the actual amount that is being spent on that measure. Okay. Obviously, I'm online and I can't tell how confused anyone is. Does anyone want to ask any questions at this point? Feel free to jump in. Okay, we can come back to it if need be. I know this is the one that tends to trip people up a little bit. So second, we had directorate budget statements. So these ones are statements for each individual directorate that that shows the key things that that directorate will do. So in the directorate budget statements, it is a little bit less glossy than the Outlook. It tends to be a bit less of that political document and a bit more of the management document for the directorate. So it shows key things like the purpose of the agency and their priorities, as well as the agreed strategic objectives. So they will break it down into specific accountability mechanisms that are agreed to as part of that appropriation. So they're basically committing to exactly what the directorate is all about and how they are measuring what they do. It'll also show their estimated staffing levels, and it will show and it will re-display the table from the budget outlook of new measures within that directorate. But any new measures contained in the directorate budget statement are the same as those contained in the budget outlook. So what do we find in the directorate statements that's different from the outlook? The key things to know are we find changes to recurrent funding. So existing funding within the agency that has changed will show up in a table called changes to appropriations. And this can be a little bit confusing to read because you don't get the same descriptions as you get in the budget outlook. So this is where you might find some buried cuts to spending that we didn't know about, or we can't always explain without further information from the relevant directorate. So you'll see on that first table I've got on the left for you the changes to appropriation. That's what the table looks like. It's got the forward estimates there, and you'll start to see some minus signs in that table. So you can see, the sexual assault review that's there, that's minus 1,223. That money was redistributed elsewhere. I actually don't know exactly where on that specific one, but what it's telling you is that there is a change of that much money has been removed from their budget moving forward. So oftentimes what you'll find in these changes to appropriation here that are a bit difficult to comprehend is that the agency itself might have shuffled money around. So just like any organizational budget, say you had an underspend in one area, you shuffled that money within your agency to another area, this is where it's going to show up. So sometimes it's a cut to things. Oftentimes it's a movement of money from one area within an agency to another. Unfortunately for us, being outside the public sector and reading this budget, you can't always tell. But I think it's an important area to have a look at if you are a community sector organization and trying to figure out what might have happened that you weren't sure of. So was there money shuffled out of certain programs? It definitely starts to expose places where we would generally start to ask questions of directorates and of ministers if we see anything that looks unusual there. Oftentimes there is an explanation and it's relatively straightforward. Sometimes it's not as clear, but it's something we always look at. The middle table there is the new policy measures. It'll show you the table just as it appears in the budget outlook, just consolidated into that specific agency's new policy measures. The third table I've got there for you is just an example of what the KPIs look like. So these are the ones that are reported on in annual reports. So against every type of output that directorate is responsible for, they will have targets that they have agreed to meet, and these are legislated. So you can see last year's targets in previous budgets, and then they're reported on annual reports. Unfortunately, they don't consolidate the reporting of those in a very particularly clear way for us to track over time. You have to go from one budget to next year's annual report and kind of trace them through time. But it's worth it having a look at, particularly if you're in any particular areas that you know that they've got responsibilities for, to have an understanding of what the KPIs they're reporting on are. It might be something where you might have an issue with those KPIs, or you might want to be aware of them and just know what they are for your own benefit, but they are all in the directorate statements. Okay, so the last one is what I called the purely political bit, which are the government priority statements. So these statements aim to highlight areas that the government sees as being particularly important. So things like the wellbeing budget statement. What they're really good for is giving you a quick overview of a particular area. So it will give you everything that's happening that might be spread across multiple directorates and multiple areas, and condense that into one statement that gives you a good summary of what's going on. The thing to be wary of in these is that it's not part of the actual appropriation. So the specific amount of money that is being spent is listed in the budget statements, not in the government priority statements. So what you will find in some of these is that the government will give you the broader picture of what it's done in that domain. So in wellbeing, they might talk about what they've been doing the last 3 or 4 years in terms of supporting the wellbeing of Canberrans. And that might be actually a really good narrative to understand and a really good way to enter into understanding what's actually happened in a medium term. The problem is that that can get confusing because it can start to conflate different buckets of money and look like they're spending more money than they actually are. So government priority statements, I normally suggest they're worth reading to understand how the government sees its own achievements and its own priorities within a specific area. They are good for getting a summary if you are very short on time. Always take them with a little bit of a grain of salt that some of the spending listed in there might have occurred in previous budget periods and may not be the current and new spend coming in. So read them with that lens in mind, that these are about the government's political positioning, which is not unimportant, but it's different from the appropriation. So the summary, and I will get these slides sent out to everyone after this, that I guess is important to look at to know where you're trying to find things in the budget. So new spending and revenue measures are in the budget outlook. Chapter 3 of the budget outlook has all the new spending and all the new revenue measures, and it has them in the most detail. So while those measures are contained in each directorate statement, the directorate statements only have them in tables. The budget outlook has the table and it has the actual descriptor of the new initiative in all the detail you're going to get. If you're looking for cuts and reprofiling of finances, so where by reprofiling, I mean that's where money might have been shuffled from one area within a directorate to another, that's all in the individual directorate budget statements. That's where you're going to find that information. That includes staffing changes, increases, or decreases. Recurrent spending, so any existing spending that was on from previous budgets or ongoing spending, is contained in the individual directorate budget statements. Finally, infrastructure. I didn't mention this at the top in the budget outlook, but infrastructure spending on community projects or any other projects is also in the budget outlook at the tail end of chapter 3 of the budget outlook. So before I take questions, I want to also just remind you what ATCOSS does around the budget, aside from running these sorts of trainings. So the budget being released tomorrow, we produce 2 documents around that. One is our media release, that's our official response to it. The other thing we do is a budget bulletin. So our whole team gets together and does essentially a summary of budget items that we see as relevant to the community sector to be distributed the day after the budget, to try to give a broad overview of what we've seen in this budget and to get feedback as well, because we're aware that there'll be many groups that have a more detailed understanding of some areas than we do. We also run 2 online post-budget events. So the day after the budget, we do a members debrief where we give our views on the budget and what we've found, and also open the floor for members to share their views. Last year, we had some particularly helpful comments around people finding some buried changes in those recurrent spendings that we weren't aware of. So very helpful to get kind of open views from members, and we really appreciate that. We also have a ministerial forum on the 23rd of June. So this year it is 4 hours long, but the entire ministry will be available, one minister after another, including the Chief Minister this year, to answer questions around the budget. So I've just given a lot of information and I want to make sure I open the floor for questions. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can see everybody's faces. But I wanted to open it up now for any questions, queries, anything else that you're unsure of at this point in time.
We've just had Quadro in the chat ask a few questions. So the first question is there any part of the budget that provides any indication on the performance of the previous year's budgetary allocation?
No. I mean, the short answer is no, but it depends on how you understand their reasoning. So the extent to which you will get it is in the overall table of like the headline net operating budget and those sort of things, where you'll see that they provide what their budgeted output was for last year, and then they will provide the estimated outcome. So the gap between those, theoretically, Quadro will tell you what the performance was against what they actually spent versus what they actually intended to spend. That doesn't tell you how they performed relative to the measures. It tells you how they spent relative to the proposed spending. The performance will come through annual statements and those annual plans, which is somewhat problematic because you've kind of got them separated into different places where they'll have to state that. So in the annual reports each year, they have to state essentially each directorate how they performed against the agreed metrics that were in the budget. Again, that comes into a metric problem because how did you perform relative to what we would see as your performance versus how did you perform relative to the metrics that were agreed upon? So if you're looking for how did we perform against the last budget, you're not going to get that until the annual reports come out, and they will come out generally post-budget because they'll wait till the end of financial year to report on everything that happened. So we won't actually have their performance measures until kind of September, usually.
Great, thank you for that. And the second question is, does the budget provide reasons for offsets?
No. So we actually, I guess the answer is sometimes. It depends on exactly where. So sometimes they've had things where there's been programs undersubscribed and they make that really clear. So if it's a large offset, like say they've got a major program that was undersubscribed or they've decided didn't work, they will often state that. So they had a statement on the Safer Families Levy and what hadn't been spent out of that last year and explained where that money was, then it came up repeatedly when they had offset against that, saying this has been offset from this funding, and it was essentially an underspend. Otherwise, they will often just say offset, and they frequently do offset against expenses. We raised this with the treasurer directly because it's completely unclear, right? If you say from expenses, what does that mean? Whose money, which bucket, what was underspent? And if it's enough small buckets of money that has come from different places, they won't break that down for you and tell you. And they see that as too much work. So sometimes they will say where it was offset from. More often than not, they will tell you it is an offset from within a specific directorate, or they will tell you it is an offset from expenses, neither of which we can have any certainty of what it is, and the government is not clear that they will answer. Any further questions?
I think you probably covered this, but how do we get invited to Thursday's budget? Members debrief.
Leanne, do you want to jump in on that one?
Yeah, so just go onto our website and you can register yourself there. So I'll pop the link in the chat, and then just feel free to register. All the information will go through to us, and you'll automatically be sent that invite.
Thank you.
So just obviously while we've got the group here, if anyone's thinking of other questions, I also do want to remind everyone that this is part of a broader effort by ACOS to try to work with the community sector around the budget. So we do have a verbal commitment from Treasury to help us develop a better template for submitting to the budget for next year. We obviously generated our own this year and I ran two training sessions last year about how to submit to the budget. We're going to do that again later this year. So September, October, I think is when they're scheduled, which will include a bit more of a bit of this sort of run through again, just to get everyone on the same page, and then going through how to submit and what the government looks for in their submissions. We're pretty keen to try to get, I guess, try to get as much community sector literacy on budgets as possible to try to get as many of our members contributing into that budget as we can. So we are hoping to do these sort of things as much as possible to help people understand and interact with the budget and interact with ministers and put them under a bit of pressure for keep them to account for their spending decisions. Do we have any further questions?
Okay, it seems like there's no more questions. I might just do a quick wrap up and give you guys back some time in your day. Thank you, Jacob, for providing that overview of the budget. It was really helpful. Hopefully everyone online learned something. So I just wanted to highlight, we have a few upcoming training events. We have the post-budget forum coming up, which is on our website. We have an LGBTQIA training with Meridian, which is offered free to the sector. So I suggest, if you haven't done this already, to do it. We also have a few online consultations for the community sector climate adaptation plan. So if you have any issues relating to the facility you're in, some workforce issues that are related to climate changes or climate impacts, please register for those to provide your input. And finally, we have another training on effective communications and social media. So this helps organizations, particularly in like comms roles or anyone that's managing social media, I guess, to help them craft clear, compelling messages that can be used across all platforms. And that's also available on our website. If you have any questions, Jacob's just put his the policy email in the chat, and I've also just put in the 60-second evaluation for today's session. So if you could please provide your feedback, that would be great. And that's everything. So I'll let you guys go and have some more time back in your day. Thanks for attending.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.